Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Australian Longitudinal Study on Women's Health Symposium. My name is Professor Julie Byles. I'm from the University of Newcastle and I'm joined today by Professor Gita Mishra from the University of Queensland. And we're going to be talking with you about different aspects of healthy ageing. I'm going to be talking about healthy ageing and aged care, and Gita's going to be talking about menopause. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the various lands on which we meet today, and pay our respects to ancestors and descendants and to elders past, present and emerging. The topic of today's session is healthy ageing. So I'm going to present, as I said, about healthy ageing and aged care, and I'm going to be focusing on what I see as a wide window of opportunity and a long tail of prevention. Following that, we'll have a Q&A session, so please get your questions ready as we're talking. And after I've spoken, we've had Q&A, then Gita Mishra from the University of Queensland will present on reproductive health, menopause and cardiovascular disease, and we'll have a second Q&A session after Gita's. So we really welcome your questions. We're hoping that after we present, there'll be some time for interaction and discussion. And we ask you to submit your questions through the Pollev using the link that was sent to you and which appears on the screen right now. A little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphones and cameras off during the session and lower your hand icon if your question has been answered, and then we know not to call on you again. So to get started, we're going to present the first video, Wide Window of Opportunity and Long Tail of Prevention, but I'll warn you that something through the glitches of technology, my head's been chopped off by the video, and so sometimes you might only see my nose and chin. But I'm still with you, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julie Byles, and I'm going to be talking about healthy ageing and aged care. I'm going to put some emphasis on the wide window of opportunity that we have earlier in life to make a difference to how we age, and how we can extend prevention right through into aged care, considering aged care and care at the later stages of life as a long tail of prevention, extending quality of life right through to the very end. So here we have the two older cohorts of the longitudinal study on women's health, the women born in 1946 to 51 and the women born 1921 to 26. So that oldest group, born 1921 to 26, they were 70 to 75 when we started the study, and we've been following those women right through their 90s, and the first will turn 100 next year. And they've shown us a lot about aging. They've shown us a lot about healthy aging. They've shown a lot about the development of disease and disability as women age. They've shown us a lot about how women respond to those changes in their lives, and they've shown us a lot about how they may or may not interact with the aged care system and their pathways into and through aged care. The 1946-51 cohort are now moving into their 70s, and so they're starting on the journey that we've already been on with those older women. And what we don't know is how similar or different their journey will be, given their different backgrounds, the different periods they were born into, and the different opportunities they've had throughout life, and also the different challenges that they've faced. So we do have a bit of a promising sign in the data. We're showing there the physical functioning scores over time for the women in the 1946-51 cohort being higher at age 70 than they were for the older cohort when we started with that cohort. So let's begin by having a look at how that 1921-26 cohort have experienced aging over the time that we've been running the longitudinal study on women's health. And then we'll come back and see what we think the future might look like for those women in the 1946-51 cohort, and what windows of opportunity we have and how we can extend that tail of prevention. These are the women in the 1921-26 cohort, and it shows what's happened to the women as they've aged from their 70s, in 70 to 75 in 1996, right through to their 90s, so looking at 90 to 95 in 2016. Now, over that period of time, Some of the women who started the study have died. So by the time we get to 2016, 65% of that cohort have died. If we look at the survivors and how they've responded to each survey from 1996 to 2016, we've classified them into 3 groups. The first group have no major disease or disability. The second group have one or more of a set of chronic diseases: arthritis, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, asthma, or cancer, but they do not have any disability. And we've defined disability as a physical functioning score of less than 40 and or need for help with daily tasks. And then the third group are the group who have disability and with lower physical functioning scores and need for help with daily tasks. And what you can see is at the start of the study, when the women were 70 to 75, if we took 20 women, then 7 of them would have no disease or disability. 8 of them would have chronic disease but no disability, and 5 of them would have chronic disease and disability. And as we go on, the proportion of the survivors who've got disability increases, and the proportion of the survivors who have no major disease or disability decreases. But there are a large number of women who live for a long time with chronic disease but no disability. And this is what we're calling the wide window of opportunity, the window where people have a chronic disease, but there's a lot that can be done to prevent the progression of that disease and the development of disability. This group of women who have disease but no disability have not been very widely studied in healthy ageing research, with much of the research focusing on the group with no major disease or disability, who are called the successful agers. We've used statistical models to develop patterns of trajectories of successful ageing. And in doing that, I've been able to identify 6 main groups as the women have aged from their 70s through to their 90s. For this analysis, we've used as a reference group around a quarter of the women who were in the class labelled usual ages. And these women lived up to about 85 years of age, and then there was a high mortality rate after that. And they spent most of their later years with some level of disease and disability. So these are the reference group for all of the other comparisons. So if we focus on the group at the bottom there, the successful ages, the dark green group, around 6% of women were able to remain in that category for the entire period of observation right through to their 90s. Okay, so this group of women had very low rates of disease, very low rates of disability, and a low mortality rate. So they were long-lived and living well. And at 70 to 75 years at the baseline study, these women were more likely to be better educated, married, non-smokers, have healthy weight, exercise, and have better social support. The next group are the group that we were talking about is the managed ages, and that adds another 9% of women in who lived through to their 90s, chronic conditions, but very low rates of disability. At 70 to 75 years, those women were more likely to be better educated, married, managed on income, the non-smokers, healthy weight, exercise, and have better social support. Then we move to the group which we've called the usual ages long survivors. So these are the women who are aging with some disease, some disability, but they're living past their mid-80s and into their 90s. And at 70 to 75 years, these women were better educated, married, non-smokers, overweight or obese, and better social support. There's 2 other groups to consider. There's a group there who had early mortality and who actually mostly deceased by 82 to 87 years. And those women, compared to the usual ages who lived beyond around 85 years, at 70 to 75, they were more likely to have difficulty managing on income, to smoke, low exercise, less likely to be overweight. A final group are the group who survived but didn't return surveys. What these trajectories tell us that chronic disease is a common part of later life. So while prevention of chronic disease is important for successful ageing and prevention of functional limitations, Few women will survive to their 90s with no major disease or disability, and many women will live with chronic disease for a long time. Many women will also live with chronic disease without developing disability, and that's our wide window of opportunity. Even if someone has developed a chronic condition, we can prevent disease progression and complications. So turning now to a focus on the women's physical abilities and looking at how the physical abilities change over age. Usually we present this as one line that's the average line for all the women. But using statistical modelling, we're able to separate different lines for different groups of women. So we have some women who enter their 70s with very high levels of physical functioning. They can run and lift heavy objects, they can walk kilometres, climb stairs, carry groceries, do housework. And a number of those women will remain having very high levels of physical ability right throughout their later years and into their 90s. So that's the purple line. And I think we'd all want to be on that purple line if we could be. Then there's a group who start off with moderate levels of physical functioning scores, whose scores decline so that by the time they reach their 90s, they're having difficulty climbing stairs, walking more than 500 metres, bending or stooping, and doing most activities of daily living. And there's a fourth group who actually age with consistently low levels of physical functioning. So these women would need help with most activities of daily living for most of their later years and for quite an extended period of time. And what we've been able to do in our analysis is work out the factors that increase the risk that somebody's in the yellow line rather than the purple line. And the things that seem to matter are education. So the higher education, you're 62% less likely to have poor physical function. Exercise, if you have the highest level of physical activity, you are 96% less likely to have poor physical function. If you have even a low level of physical activity, you're 81% less likely to have poor physical function. Body mass index makes a difference. So if you're overweight, you're 5 times more likely to have poor physical function. And if you're obese, you're 26 times more likely to have poor physical function. Being a smoker at baseline meant that women were nearly 3 times more likely to have poor physical function. Having a disease like arthritis, stroke, osteoporosis, heart disease or diabetes, hypertension, bronchitis or asthma all increase the probability that the women would have poor physical function, and having another comorbidity on top of any given disease increased the likelihood by another 3 times. Another way of looking at how the women have aged is to have a look at their disability-free life expectancy. So if we look at the most educated group of women who had higher than school certificate education and take the best scenario where they're non-smokers, not obese, and they undertake a degree of physical activity, they can expect to live 21.4 years from 70, and 18.8 of those years will be free of disability and 2.7 of those years will be with disability. But if we take the opposite end of that set of possibilities, and we've got women who were only educated up to school certificate or lower, and if they're smokers, obese, and they don't do physical activity at baseline, then they can expect to live 16.1 years. So they got 5.3 years less than the best group. They will spend 12 of those years free of disability and 4.1 years with disability. So not only are they living shorter lives, they're living a greater proportion of their lives with disability, and they're living longer, more years with disability. So for those women who are living a long time with disability and with need for help with daily tasks, aged care is going to be a normal part of their life. So we found in our analysis of the aged care data that most women will use aged care at some time, starting with basic supports and often entering residential aged care in the last 2 to 3 years of life. We've also been able to have a look inside the home and community care data, as it was then, to have a look at what sort of services women were receiving in the community. So most of this is looking at the services used by women over a 10-year period, and most of the women were using what we've called a basic or low level of services. So they're using few services and not a lot of them. And if we look at what's happened to the women over the years in terms of their use of services, and we start at age 75 to 80, most of the women, 81%, are having no formal service use. They may be getting help from friends and family, but no formal aged care service use. 5% of women are getting some level of basic home care, 12% moderate to high home care, and 2% in residential care. And then if we fast forward to when the women are 85 to 90, now only 35% are having no levels of formal service use. 15% are having the basic home care, 29% the moderate to high home care, and 21% are in residential care. But there's again great variation in the use of aged care with different patterns of use among different sets of women. And so we've sorted those patterns out into women who remain mostly non-users of aged care throughout their later lives, women who remain mostly moderate to high levels of home and community care users, a group who died early and didn't use aged care, and a group who are increasingly using residential aged care the older they get. A little help helps, and a little more help helps more. Most women are using a low volume of a few home services. These include domestic assistance, home maintenance, transport, nursing, meals, care coordination. We've also found that home care can slow the rate of admission to residential aged care. So the earlier the use and the more home services used reduce the cumulative incidence rate of admission to residential aged care. It is important to note that after a long period of home care, residential aged care was still required. The other thing we noted by looking backwards at when women were admitted to aged care and looked at what service they'd had beforehand, we found that more than 20% of women had not received any home care services prior to admission to aged care, and around 30% had only used one or two services and for a short time. When we look at what happens from the point where women are admitted to residential aged care, we find, based on their ACFI scores, that they have rapidly increasing needs. So the women who enter residential aged care in the study stayed more than 2.5 years on average, and we identified 5 patterns of increase in residential aged care needs across the domains of activities of daily living, behaviour, and complex health care. This shows those patterns. So you've got 3 groups there across the rows, ADL, behaviour, and complex healthcare. And 5 groups emerged, those with the lowest levels of limitations and needs right up to those with the highest levels of limitations and needs. But I draw your attention to the complex healthcare needs and to see that even when that starts off low, it's increasing rapidly during the women's stay in residential aged care. So aged care should be the long tail of prevention. We should be looking at anticipating and planning for people's future needs so that it doesn't come as a shock and suddenly you've got to put things into place. We should be bringing forward health promotion, participation and engagement and promoting those things earlier in women's older age. We should be improving earlier access and increased use of community care with a focus on reablement, supporting people to do the things they can do and being strengths-based, as well as compensating for what people can't do without help. We need to focus and to continue focusing throughout life on the prevention of disease progression, malnutrition, infections, falls, medication misadventure, and other adverse events. Within aged care, we know from the Royal Commission we've got to avoid physical and chemical restraints, and we should be focusing on end of life and quality of death as well as quality of life. So what's the future look like for the women in the 1946-51 cohort? And this graph suggests that it's looking pretty good. And this picture shows the disability-free life expectancy estimated for the 1921-26 cohort as they've aged from 70 through to 85, and also estimates the expected disability-free life expectancy for the 1946-51 cohort as they age from their 70s through to their 80s. What's important to note is that the 1946-51 cohort are expected to have a longer life expectancy and also expected to have a longer disability-free life expectancy. But it's also worth noting that larger gap between the green line, which represents the best of the outcomes in the groups that we've compared, and the red line, which represents the worst of the outcomes in the groups that we can have compared. And while the 1946-51 cohort, their estimated disability-free life expectancy is better on all curves, we also see a large discrepancy and a larger gap between the best in the green line and the worst in the red line. So thank you for listening, and thank you for considering the wide window of opportunity and the long tail of prevention that we can carry through right to the very end of women's lives.
Thank you, everybody, for that. Now, please put your questions in the Polev, and we do have one question already. So I'm going to read that one out and answer it. So the question is, do you collect data on the social, financial or family reasons women decide to move or not to move into residential aged care? Now, we do. The answer is we do, but not in the way you might think. So we don't wait for women to move or not move and then say, what were you thinking? Instead, we've actually got data for those women from when they were 70. So sometimes we've got 10, 15, 20 years of data before the women move or don't move into residential aged care. So we're actually able to tell a lot about the upstream factors, the trajectories that the women have been on in terms of their later life and their circumstances. We can look at what their circumstances were like at 70, or we can look at what their circumstances were like in the survey most recent to their admission to residential aged care. And so we have looked at that, and there are a number. I mean, obviously the main reasons people move into residential aged care is because of dementia, because of physical and other health limitations. But there are also some social reasons why people that seem to affect whether or not people move into aged care, and being widowed is one of them. You know, the availability of family and social supports, where they live, and the availability of aged care and alternatives to aged care. Their access to home and community care makes a difference, as I said in the presentation. And there are some differences in terms of the women's socioeconomic status and ability to manage on income as well. And this does seem to make a difference. So we have done quite a lot of analysis looking at the waiting times between getting an assessment and getting aged care services or admission to residential aged care. We've looked at time to admission to residential aged care, and we've looked at what are the factors associated with different states when the women move into residential aged care as well. And they all tend to be different factors. And so happy to share those with you. And we have some reports on that on our website as well. So the next question is, how important do you think malnutrition is? Somebody must know me, because I think it's really, really, really important. One of the things we find with the women in the study, and I presented that there, hinted at it, I suppose, when we talked about the early mortality group. So being too thin is not a good thing when you're older. It's better to be, in fact, it's better to be a little bit overweight, but not too much overweight. So what we find when we look at weight is a little bit overweight, so BMI of around about 26, the women had a longer total life expectancy, but higher than that, you still had a longer life expectancy, but more years with disability. So there's a real balance between enough weight to be healthy and not so much weight that you'll develop some level of disability. So malnutrition, both underweight and overweight, because remember we can be malnourished but still be overweight, are really important as people age, and it's important for everything we can think of in terms of bones, muscle, balance, immunity, and also cognition, because, you know, if you're constipated, you're not going to think as well as if you're not. But also food is just a great enjoyment in life, so let's enjoy right throughout our lives. Another question is, are there any suggested reasons which indicate why there's such a large difference between the different groups on that last slide? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that we've actually got a really big spread between the best and the worst in terms of that healthy life expectancy. I will point out that the very worst, one of the big reasons why that's so different is because the cohorts have actually changed. So what it means to have less than secondary education, not completing higher school certificate, when you were born in 1946 to 51 is actually different to what it would have meant in terms of the social strata in 1921-26. So we're actually getting a different part of the social strata and a greater level of disadvantage for the red line in the 46-51 group and the red line in the 21-26 group. So that's one reason, because it's representing a higher degree of disadvantage. And likewise, I think with some of the health behaviours, you know, smoking became more common actually in that 46-51 cohort than the 21-26 cohort. So I think we're actually seeing some real cohort differences in disadvantage and what that means in terms of health behaviours and health outcomes. Do I expect the gap to increase in the next cohort? Yes. I do. I do. And I think, you know, yesterday we talked about the increasing incidence and prevalence of obesity the further we go down the cohorts, and as those cohort age, that's very socioeconomically determined. If we look at smoking is less and less as we go down the cohorts now. But again, socioeconomically determined. I think we will see bigger gaps with successive cohorts, unfortunately. What areas of intervention do I see to promote healthy ageing, and what ages do you think are most important to target? Oh, you guys don't want to go home, do you? Because I'll be here forever. Yeah, look, I think healthy ageing actually starts in utero. So when you're the blastocyst, get started with your healthy ageing, and follow it through. And when Gita's going to present on some things in a minute, which will be very important around that sort of midlife impacts. But if you want to talk about healthy ageing rather than just general health promotion for people, I'm actually thinking that around retirement's a really good age to start, because people are changing their behaviours then anyway, and you may as well change your behaviours for the better rather than for the worse. So I'm concentrating my efforts and grant applications, et cetera, on starting with people in their retirement. And the other reason I'm doing that is because often that's the generation that are caring for the older generation who are needing care and needing to navigate aged care. So I think you get a 2-for-1, because you get people to think about their own ageing and what they can do to optimise that. You also get people to think about aged care and how they can plan for their own aged care, but also maybe help the older generation and interacting with to navigate that better and get more out of it. That was the short answer. If you want a long answer, contact me later. Okay, so that's the end of my Q&A session, and I'm very pleased now to hand over to Gita to talk about reproductive health and menopause.
My topic today is on menopause. It fits in the healthy aging priority as mentioned in the National Women's Health Strategy 2020-2030. One of the action items is to support women and their healthcare providers to manage the effects of menopause. In this talk, I'll present results from our recent work, which include using data from the Australian Long-Term Study on Women's Health to provide a more detailed understanding of the relationship between menopause and her future health. Just to recap on menopause, every woman goes through menopause, and most women spend almost 40% of their life in the postmenopausal stage. Biologically, it happens when the ovary runs out of follicles. During reproductive years, around 400 to 500 matured eggs are released, and by menopause, none are left. So therefore, menopause marks the end of a woman's reproductive life. There are two types of menopause: the natural menopause. So this is an age-related process involving the failure of ovarian function. It is defined as 12 months of amenorrhea. And then you have surgical menopause, where it is defined by the removal of both ovaries, also known as bilateral oophorectomies, usually performed during the time of hysterectomy. So menopause can be considered as a marker of an ovarian or reproductive aging. If a woman experiences menopause before the age of 40, she's said to have premature menopause, and there is around 1% to 2% of them. If she experiences menopause between the age of 40 to 44, then she's said to have early menopause, and there's around 7% of them. So around 1 in 10 women will experience menopause before the age of 45. This is the distribution of age and menopause from the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health. As you can see, the mean age is around 51 years and the median is around 51.9 years. So in order to study the association between menopause and health across the different socio-cultural groups, we initiated the Interlace Consortium. It is based on the strength of ALSWH to provide solid, core, high-quality data. To date, Interlace has over 800 women, 26 studies from across 11 countries. And as of next month, we'll be getting data from the Netherlands. One of the first things we did was to look at the relationship between premature and early menopause and the risk of non-fatal cardiovascular disease. In this paper, we just focused on women who experience natural menopause, and there is around 4.5% of women had experienced cardiovascular disease after menopause. On this graph here, you'll see on the y-axis is the risk or the hazard ratio, and on the x-axis is the age at menopause. So this is the group of premature menopause, this is the group of early menopause. And this is the group who have menopause at the average age. So they are our reference group. So this graph shows that women who experience premature menopause or early menopause, she is at a higher risk of experiencing non-fatal cardiovascular event after menopause. And I guess the most important question here is exactly when after menopause. And I think we're one of the few studies to be able to demonstrate the timing. So if we looked at this graph here, so the first batch shows, is looking at when she experienced her first non-fatal cardiovascular event before the age of 60. And what you see here is that women who experience premature menopause, she has a risk of 1.88 of experiencing non-fatal event before the age of 60. Similarly, if she has a menopause at the age of 40 to 44, then she's at 1.4 times the risk compared to women who have menopause at the average age. So this is pretty powerful to say to a woman that, you know, for those with premature menopause, she's at a much higher risk of experiencing her first non-fatal cardiovascular event before she hits 60. If you look at this panel of data, these are women who experience between 60 to 69, their first cardiovascular event. You can see that those who have early or premature menopause still are at an increased risk, but perhaps not as marked as those before 60. Now, if she hasn't had cardiovascular event by the time she's 69, by the time she's 70, then her risk of getting the first non-fatal cardiovascular event is very similar to all women. So this is important in terms of timing and advising women. What about the role of smoking? We do know that smoking increases both the risk of having early menopause, but it also increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. And in this case here, I'd want to draw your attention to the first graph here, which shows that women who have premature menopause, and she's a current smoker, she's at a much higher risk, 3 times the risk of getting a non-fatal cardiovascular event compared with women who are premenopausal. So similarly here, I want to draw your attention to this box here. These are women who have premature menopause, but she's a non-smoker. What you see here is that even amongst non-smokers, if she has earlier age of menopause, she seems to be at a higher risk of experiencing non-fatal cardiovascular disease. So this is an important finding that really did take a lot of media attention, and it was published in News GP. That's a website that goes to all the GPs in the country. We also wrote a conversation article on perimenopause and women's health, relating using some of the results that I've mentioned. So the next thing is to focus on really what is the relationship between surgical menopause and the risk of cardiovascular disease. And this work was published this year. The results can be presented here. You will be very familiar with this panel. These are women with age at natural menopause, which I've just talked about. And this is no surprising. Earlier age of menopause was associated with higher incidence of non-fatal cardiovascular disease. But this is probably one of the very few studies that is able to look at age of natural menopause and age at surgical menopause side by side. And what here we see is that women who've had surgical menopause, and this is really defining as having bilateral oophorectomy, if she's had it by the age of 35, her risk of getting non-fatal cardiovascular is very high. It's more than 2.5 times compared with those who have menopause at the age of 50, 51. Similarly, if she has some menopause between the age of 35 to 39, again, she's at an increased risk. So all along, the earlier the age of menopause, surgical menopause, the higher is the risk. But what it also demonstrates is that, so here, for the same age of menopause, so whether, if you look at this group here who've got menopause, natural menopause less than 35, this group here has natural menopause less than, surgical menopause less than 35. So the age at menopause is the same, but it's a different way of obtaining it, then it possesses a different magnitude of risk. So this is obviously a lot higher than that. So the implication of this study is really to show that earlier surgical menopause, that is less than 45 years, poses additional increased risk of incident CVD events compared with women with natural menopause at the same age. These women may need close monitoring in clinical practice. The other thing that our study have highlighted is really how it is important to consider female-specific factors. We need to take these into account when we are assessing CVD risk among women. We try and put all this in our recent article in the conversation, where we really highlighted the need for women to, the importance for screening for preventive health. Thank you. Wow.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gita, for that presentation. It was really fascinating. Sorry, I was a bit fascinated. So I'd just like to invite people to ask questions of Gita. And Gita, can you see the questions? There aren't any questions yet?
No, there aren't, no.
Any questions yet? So I'll give people a couple of minutes to put their questions in for Gita.
I guess one of the discussion point that we can keep going or talked about is the fact that, you know, age of menopause, it's not, well, it is modifiable. So something can be done to lengthen the age of menopause. So for instance, women who smoke are most likely to have lower risk of menopause. So you can do something about it to a certain extent. But mostly it is not really modifiable. Oh, right. So I've got a question here. So shall I address the question and then come back?
Yes, please. answer the question. That's brilliant. But an important question about, it's an important issue about smoking, lowering the age at menopause, as well as increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease in its own right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
don't do it. Whatever you do, don't smoke.
Don't smoke. We also found in our some of the work is even having a high BMI tended to be associated with earlier risk of menopause. So one of the questions that's been posted is how can the risk factors be reduced or avoided? In terms of so there are modifiable factors that you can try and reduce, as we just mentioned about smoking. But more importantly, is that if a woman experiences their early menopause, right, before the age of 40 or even before the age of 45, what she can do is make sure that she monitors her cardiovascular risk factors. So make sure you do regular screening, get your blood blood pressure tested, make sure you keep healthy, do exercise. So there are a lot of things that we can be doing. And in fact, women who have that risk of early menopause, they should be doing a bit more. So it's not all doom and gloom. And in many ways, the way I like to think about it is menopause is like a crystal ball. It tells you about your health in the future. So let's act on it while you're still as, young and able to do it, which is what Julie was saying about, before retirement. It's a good time. So I have another question. What are the areas of research into the female-specific risk factors for cardiovascular or other impacts of early menopause might have? Okay, so early menopause, we're looking at women having an increased risk of osteoporosis, poor bone health, and that is due to the fact that they have less exposure to estrogen. All right, so that's one thing. We're also showing some results have shown that they tended to have poorer lung function, and this is something that we want to replicate in using ALSWH data. Those are some of the key things. There's also studies that have been shown that early menopause is, it's associated with higher risk of dementia. We don't know that, but there's a lot of speculation. And again, we want to be able to use large data sets to be able to, confirm the finding or not. The other thing also, I think that while in the model we've done with age of menopause, one of the things that I would also like to add in the model is actually the length of estrogen duration. So how long they've been exposed to duration. So that's a difference between menarche and menopause. And what we found is women with shorter duration of estrogen exposure had higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And that's something that we've shown using this data. But I would also like to take into account that women with pregnancy complication, for instance, preeclampsia, what is her risk of menopause, early menopause, and then how that is associated with cardiovascular disease. So there's a lot still to unpick and learn. This is a good question. The second question is there suggested biological reasons for surgical menopause correlates with increased risk, CVD risk? This must be a question from an epidemiologist, I think. Okay, first of all, just to give you a bit of a highlight, just a bit of statistics, the risk of surgical menopause is around 10%. We believe, there's, again, we can't, with our data, we cannot say causal, but we can definitely say associated. It could be that, let's think about why women have surgical menopause, right? So this is the removal of both ovaries. Now, a lot of time this happens during hysterectomy. So, and the percent of hysterectomy, at least in Australia, is 30%. Right? So out of this 30% of women who have hysterectomy, around 10% of them would have their ovaries removed. We believe that the reason for hysterectomy, and it might just be that, while the surgeon is there getting rid of the uterus. They might even get rid of the ovaries without really thinking too much about the consequences. Because one of the reasons why women get their ovary removed is for cancer. But hysterectomy, as I said, it's a more common procedure. People get it done for fibroids, endometriosis, dysfunctional uterine bleeding. All these could also be related in itself, may be related to cardiometabolic conditions. So women with fibroids are at a higher risk of cardiometabolic conditions. So these are all clustering now. I can't say which is chicken, which is egg, but it seems like if you have, hysterectomy, you would tend to be at a higher risk of, even diabetes we've shown, so you have a higher poorer cardiometabolic profile, and all that kind of leads to, we know it's related to cardiovascular disease event. So the other thing also, I think our study highlighted is surgical menopause. Yes, it's increased risk, but the timing of surgical menopause is also is the driver in terms of the risk, and that could just be that she hasn't had the enough exposure to estrogen for good cardiovascular health. What we did find is that if the women were on hormone therapy, it did reduce the risk, but it didn't eliminate it. So, yeah. So that's one question. If all these risk factors are so well known, why don't GP focus on CVD health when they know their patient is going through menopause? Very, very good questions. And I think that is what the long study and all, we're using data from big studies to demonstrate that this needs to be taken into account when screening. I think there are things about early menopause. It is written in the GP book. So if they have menopause before 45, in the sense that they'll be advised or maybe encouraged to take hormone therapy up to the average age of 50. But really about screening these women and following and monitoring, I don't think it's been done enough. And this is what we would like to put out there. And that's one of the things in the conversation article. So it's definitely an area that we have enough evidence to now really go for it and get it written in the books about screening. Very good questions.
So, Gita, that's fantastic answers. But I think, too, in terms of that last question, I think it really underscores the importance of seeing women as whole beings and within a context as well, and within the context of their cohort and the period in which they live, but as whole beings. And so we shouldn't just concentrate, this is an issue about the menopause, because it's an issue about that woman's whole life and her risk factors and her future health as well. And so that's something I think we need to try to encourage people to think holistically about health across the life course and within the context of people's lives as whole organisms within a society. And I think we've got a bit of a way to go before we integrate all of that in terms of healthcare. I think you pointed that out, pointing that, if you have early menopause or if you have hysterectomy because of fibroids, this is because something's going on in your body and it's affecting your uterus, it's affecting other parts of your body as well. So I think that's really important. And the other thing I think historically is that cardiovascular disease has never been seen as a women's disease. It's been seen as a disease for men, and we've struggled to say, hey, we still get cardiovascular disease and we need appropriate investigation, treatment, prevention, rehabilitation, etc. And so I guess pushing that barrow and getting people to realise that CVD is a disease that affects women. It's not just a disease that affects men.
Julie, can I just add one thing about menopause? So when a lady goes to the GP and, it's menopause, the thing that comes to the mind is, vasomotor symptoms. She's having hot flushes, she's having night sweats. What can we do to manage that? Now, it is important because you do need to manage that because it affects quality of life, sleeping and all that. I think what we need to be mindful of is that these are all, again, a snapshot of her future health. So there's current health that you can deal with, But as you were saying, there's something else that's going underneath that needs to be dealt with before it manifests itself down the road.
Yeah, that's good. So are there any other questions? Is there anything else you'd like to add, Gita, at this point?
No, I think, I just want to say again, reiterate the importance of the longitudinal study of women's health. This is the first time, we're having the data on the women when they were just 45 to 50 years, following them up right through this important critical stage in their life up to 70, seeing what happens. I think this is a gold mine. This sort of data is right up there in terms of all the other data sets. And Julie, of course, the other thing now is that we're looking at women who were born in 1973, 78. They were 18 to 23 when they first went. Now they are in their 40s. And guess what? Already we're looking at endometriosis, but what we are finding is at least 12% of women with endometriosis already have had their uterus removed before the age of 40,
Yeah.
So what is the implication, and trying to follow them up in the thing is really for everybody to watch the spot.
That's right. And how exciting for us, Gita, you and I personally, because you get to transfer your interest to the 73, 78 cohort, and I get to transfer my interest in aging to the 46, 51 cohort. We're never going to stop.
Absolutely. And the other thing also, what we are doing with the 73, 78 cohort is we are collecting blood data, so biological data, because we wanted to look at their health before they enter menopause, because the results are presented today talks about menopause and her future health. But one of the things that we don't really know is maybe the women were already in poor health before menopause, and the menopause comes along and makes it worse. So we are at the moment collecting blood data to look at her health before she enters menopause. So exciting space.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for your attention, for joining us and for participating in this session. And I'm going to let everybody know that the pre-recordings, so our edited videos that we played without glitches, will be made available to you all. So you'll be able to review those and share them with friends. Have a special cocktail party and watch us. And so they will be available later on. And I'd like to thank everybody again for your participation and your attention and for joining us. Thanks, Gita, too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.